I stood in the gilded foyer of an elite Chicago country club, watching my father, Lucas, casually sign away my 6 sons' educational trust to fund my brother Aiden's luxury business venture. My phone vibrated, a text from my mother, Elena. "We have agreed. You are no longer part of this family." I did not cry. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. For years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill for a subscription that offered 0 returns. As a dedicated single mother and school counselor in a chilly Chicago suburb, I had spent my entire adult life carrying the invisible weight of relatives who viewed me as nothing more than a functional burden. While Aiden received sports cars, corporate backing, and limitless praise, I quietly paid for my own master's degree and absorbed every emotional blow. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. The architecture of their selective empathy was masterful. They possessed a remarkable psychological mechanism that allowed them to lavish endless grace upon Aiden for his catastrophic failures, while viewing my very real struggles as personal inconveniences. My son was undergoing intensive medical treatments, requiring specialists and therapies that drained my bank accounts. Yet, in my parents' eyes, his illness was simply a disruption to their pristine social calendar. They could easily justify their cruelty by convincing themselves that my hardships were character building, while Aiden's blunders were temporary setbacks requiring immediate financial intervention. It was a fascinating, clinical display of cognitive dissonance. They were not blind to my suffering. They simply calculated that my pain had 0 market value in their ecosystem. Then came the tyranny of the invisible debt. Growing up, I was conditioned to believe I perpetually owed them simply for existing. It was an unspoken ledger where my contributions were immediately zeroed out, and my alleged deficits carried exorbitant interest rates. When Lucas called me just 24 hours before that country club dinner, he did not ask about his grandson's health. He demanded I sign over my remaining personal savings to cover another one of Aiden's reckless family debts. He treated me like a broken ATM, entirely indifferent to the fact that those funds were earmarked for my son's life-saving medical care. The family affection I had chased for so long was entirely transactional, a poorly negotiated contract I had been born into. Now I realized it had been an automated subscription, and my willingness to pay had just expired. I looked at the country club doors one last time. There was no panic, no despair, only a sharp, freezing precision. The invisible debt was formally canceled. The emotional account was permanently closed. I walked out into the cold Chicago wind, my mind already running algorithms on how to dismantle the empire they loved more than they loved me. I had operated under their oppressive accounting system for 3 decades, paying into a family trust of loyalty that never yielded a single dividend. They were not shocked by the sheer callousness of what they had done to my son. They were going to be shocked that I had stopped playing along. I did not waste another minute hoping for a biological connection to magically generate moral decency. I simply drove home in complete, absolute silence, mapping out the systematic liquidation of my familial assets. They thought discarding me via text message was a victory. They failed to realize they had just severed the one tether keeping my retaliation in check. Anger was a liability. Calculation was a weapon. I was armed. I did not shed a single tear. I did not send a desperate reply begging for reconsideration. I simply opened my laptop and started clicking cancel on every financial lifeline I had silently provided them. I remembered the countless times I had covered their household expenses to prevent public embarrassment, paid property taxes during near foreclosures, and kept my mouth shut to preserve family harmony. I had functioned as their emergency bailout fund for over a decade. That service was now terminated. By 11:51 at night, I was auditing our shared histories. By 12:03 in the morning, my retaliation was fully mapped. Meanwhile, Aiden and Elena escalated their psychological warfare. My phone screen lit up with group chats, where they systematically gaslighted me, painting my refusal to bankrupt myself for Aiden as an act of supreme selfishness. Elena began posting passive-aggressive photos on social media, quoting verses about ungrateful daughters and the heartbreak of disloyal children. It was a pathetic PR campaign designed to control the narrative. They wanted me to feel isolated, panicked, and desperate to crawl back into their good graces. They expected an emotional collapse. Instead, I observed their frantic maneuvering with clinical detachment. Their affection was a depreciating asset, and I was cutting my losses, but Lucas could not tolerate my silence. When his text went unanswered, he decided to leverage his power. He escalated from emotional manipulation to active sabotage. On Tuesday morning, my school district superintendent pulled me into his office. Lucas had called him directly, utilizing his status as a wealthy community executive to imply that I was financially unstable and unfit to counsel students. He framed it as a concerned father reaching out. But the underlying threat was clear. Comply with my financial demands, or I will destroy your professional reputation. He thought threatening my livelihood would force me into submission. He assumed I would panic at the thought of losing the only income supporting my sick child. It was a tactical error on his part. He had mistaken my lifelong patience for weakness. My father did not realize that applying pressure to carbon only creates diamonds. I sat in my superintendent's office, calmly clarified the situation as an unfortunate and baseless family dispute, and walked out with my job entirely secure. The hostility had mounted, but my pulse remained perfectly steady. This was no longer a messy family feud. This was a hostile takeover, and Lucas had just shown his hand. He had weaponized my career, demonstrating that there were absolutely no boundaries he would respect. I rubbed my temples, not out of stress, but out of sheer, unadulterated clarity. The time for emotional endurance was officially over. It was time for systematic, legal warfare. I pulled out my phone and scrolled past the dozens of toxic messages from my mother and brother. I found the contact I needed and pressed call. I was no longer an abused daughter. I was a plaintiff preparing to strike. I poured a glass of water, watching the ice settle. My family believed they held all the cards because they controlled the emotional narrative. But emotions do not hold up in court. Paper trails do, and I had kept every single receipt. I dialed Julia's number. We had been friends in college, and she was now a notoriously ruthless, high-stakes family and corporate attorney. I did not waste time on pleasantries or emotional venting. I needed an apex predator, and Julia was the best. I need to initiate a financial freeze, I told her, the moment she answered. And I need it done yesterday. Within 2 hours, I was sitting across the polished mahogany desk in her downtown Chicago office, sliding a thick folder of financial statements and trust documents across the surface. We bypassed the emotional damage entirely and went straight to the numbers. As Julia and I methodically reviewed the ledgers, the chilling reality of their exploitation materialized in black and white. Lucas and Aiden had not just been emotionally draining me, they had been orchestrating a systematic financial drain. We focused on a protected educational trust originally established by my late grandfather. It was explicitly designated for his grandchildren's education and medical emergencies. I had always assumed the trust was depleted or tied up in investments. Instead, the audit revealed a terrifying pattern of misappropriated funds. Lucas had been quietly bleeding the accounts dry, funneling the protected assets into Aiden's failing luxury ventures. I stared at the bank statements, feeling a profound sense of vindication. I had spent years being told I was a drain on family resources, while they were literally stealing my son's future. "This is not just poor financial management, Claire," Julia said, her eyes narrowing as she traced the withdrawal dates. "This is a breach of fiduciary duty." I did not gasp. I did not break down in tears over my father's betrayal. I simply nodded. "Draft the notices," I instructed. "Freeze everything." Julia moved with lethal efficiency. She immediately drafted formal legal notices, targeting every vulnerability in their corporate structure. By the end of the business day, we had initiated a massive legal strike. We froze all joint accounts tied to the trust and slapped Lucas's pristine family business with emergency financial preservation orders. I watched Julia dispatch the couriers with clinical satisfaction. My father was used to operating with impunity, assuming his wealth shielded him from accountability. He thought he could strip me of my life savings and cast me aside without consequence. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of power. The moment those preservation orders landed on his desk, his entire operational liquidity would grind to a halt. His assets were locked. His accounts were frozen. I walked out of Julia's office into the fading Chicago light, feeling lighter than I had in a decade. I had spent my life acting as the shock absorber for their reckless behavior. The impact was going to hit them directly. I was not seeking an apology, and I certainly was not seeking reconciliation. I was executing a comprehensive financial audit of people who had been operating on stolen credit. The legal warfare had commenced, and I had just severed their supply lines. My phone began to vibrate wildly in my pocket, signaling the exact moment the bank notified Lucas of the frozen assets. I did not look at the screen. I simply silenced the device, relishing the sound of their panic echoing in the void. Just as the preliminary legal proceedings began to strangle my father's operations, Julia summoned me back to her office. Her demeanor was entirely different this time. The professional detachment had been replaced by a razor-sharp intensity. She slid a single highlighted document across the desk. "I found the kill shot," she said quietly. I looked down at the paper. It was an inheritance withdrawal record from my grandfather's trust, dated 3 years prior. The amount listed was exactly $120,000. I frowned, scanning the transaction details. "I never authorized a withdrawal of $120,000, I stated flatly. "I know," Julia replied, tapping a manicured finger against the signature line at the bottom of the page. "Look closely." I leaned in and examined the ink. It was my name, spelled out in looping cursive. But the pressure and slant were entirely wrong. The signature on the transfer document was not just unauthorized, it was a blatant, undeniable forgery, and the handwriting belonged unmistakably to Lucas. The implications locked into place with mathematical precision. My father had utilized my identity to illegally extract $120,000 from a protected trust using stolen capital to bail out Aiden's failing real estate portfolio. He had literally forged my name to steal money meant for my child's medical care, funneling it directly into my brother's pockets. This revelation fundamentally altered the battlefield. This was no longer a messy family feud over fairness or emotional neglect. This was not a civil dispute over mismanaged funds. This was a clear-cut, easily prosecutable white-collar crime. It stripped away any remaining path to redemption, obliterating the carefully constructed facade of the respectable, wealthy executive. I stared at his forged signature, feeling a cold, clinical satisfaction wash over me. For years, I had internalized their narrative that I was the problem. Now, the absolute truth was laid bare in blue ink. They were criminals, masquerading as a family. "He committed identity theft and wire fraud," Julia confirmed, already preparing the supplementary filings for the district attorney. "This carries mandatory minimums. They are completely exposed." I did not experience a single ounce of pity. There was no hesitation to protect the family name. The family name was a liability I was actively divesting from. "Send it all to the authorities," I commanded, my voice devoid of any emotional tremor. "Bypass civil litigation for this amount. Let the criminal justice system handle the theft." They had escalated the hostility by threatening my career and discarding me. I was ending it by handing them over to the law. My father had treated me like a silent investor for decades. He was about to learn that silent investors eventually demand an audit. I authorized Julia to release the forged documents to the bank's fraud department. The trap had not just been set, it had been sprung, and the steel jaws were closing rapidly around their empire. I walked out of the high-rise building, feeling the crisp air fill my lungs. The invisible chains of obligation had shattered completely. They had forged my name to sustain their illusions, but the reality they were about to face was entirely authentic. 4 years passed with the speed and efficiency of a well-executed corporate merger. Following the exposure of the corporate scandal and the subsequent legal fallout, my family's pristine empire suffered a catastrophic collapse. The criminal charges and financial penalties decimated their liquidity. Lucas and Elena faced total, unmitigated ruin. Their grand estate, once the ultimate symbol of their superiority, was officially scheduled for foreclosure. I, meanwhile, had purchased a beautiful new home in a quiet neighborhood, my son thriving thanks to the recovered trust funds. I was sitting at my kitchen island on a Tuesday afternoon when the doorbell rang. I checked the security camera. It was Lucas. He looked a decade older, the arrogance completely stripped from his posture. I did not slam the door or ignore him. Anger wasn't loud. It was accounting, and it was time to close the ledger. I calmly opened the door and invited him in. He stepped into my immaculate foyer, looking desperately out of place. He could barely meet my eyes as he stammered through a pathetic, rehearsed speech about family bonds and forgiveness. He was begging for a bailout. $150,000 to save their home from the bank. He offered empty promises of repayment, hoping to leverage a biological connection he had long ago destroyed. I let him speak until he ran out of words. The silence in the room was absolute. I did not yell. I did not berate him. I simply reached into a folder on the counter and slid a certified cashier's check across the marble island. It was made out for exactly $150,000. Lucas stared at it, his eyes wide with desperate relief. His hand trembled as he reached for the paper. But before his fingers could brush the check, I slid a second document right next to it. It was a formal, legally binding confession document, drafted by Julia. To take the money, Lucas had to sign a full admission outlining his systematic theft, his forgery, and his emotional abuse. He had to state, in explicit legal terms, that his unyielding greed and favoritism had intentionally destroyed our family. "Sign it," I instructed, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Admit it out loud, and the money is yours." He looked from the check to the document, his face flushing with a mixture of shame and fury. He was being forced to sign away his last remaining ounce of dignity. "You cannot do this to me," he whispered. "This wasn't revenge," I replied smoothly. "It was a transaction. You taught me the rules of family business. Now, pay the invoice." He hesitated for only a fraction of a second before picking up the pen. I watched with clinical detachment as he signed his name, his real name, this time. "My greed destroyed this family," he choked out, reading the final clause aloud as required. I pulled the confession toward me and pushed the check into his trembling hands. "Good doing business with you," I said coldly. "Now, get out of my house." He stumbled backward, clutching the bailout money that cost him his pride. I watched the door click shut behind him. The balance sheet was perfectly aligned. They had nothing left to take, and I was entirely free. The legal battle concluded with absolute, undeniable victory. The signed confession was the final nail in the coffin, ensuring that Lucas and Aiden faced severe criminal sentencing for their respective roles in the fraud. The empire was systematically dismantled, sold off in pieces to satisfy creditors, and massive legal fines. Elena and Beatrice faded into complete social obscurity, unable to survive in a society that no longer recognized their wealth or status. I took the funds, recovered from the trust, and established a comprehensive educational foundation. It was designed specifically to support single mothers and children facing severe medical crises, providing the exact financial and emotional lifelines that my family had intentionally denied me. Every grant we approved and every hospital bill we covered felt like a ledger being balanced in the universe. By building this organization, I ensured that my grandfather's true, authentic legacy lived on in a way he would have been proud of. I stood on the porch of my new home, watching the crisp Chicago wind move steadily through the old oak trees in the yard. My son was playing safely inside, his health stable, his future entirely secure. I closed my eyes and breathed in the cool air. experiencing a profound, hard-earned peace that settled deep into my bones. The relentless noise of my past had finally been silenced. I've come to realize that what people often misunderstand is that walking away from abusive relatives is not an act of petty revenge. It is an act of biological and psychological survival. Society loves to weaponize the cliché that blood is thicker than water, shaming victims into maintaining ties with people who treat them significantly worse than strangers. We are culturally conditioned to endure endless emotional deficits, writing off abuse as complicated family dynamics simply because we share a surname. The cultural programming is incredibly deep, demanding that we overlook severe ethical violations to keep the peace. We are told to turn the other cheek, to absorb the damage, and to keep writing checks from a bankrupt emotional account. I spent 30 years internalizing that flawed logic, believing that my exhaustion was just the normal price of familial admission. But protecting your peace is not a crime. Protecting your child is not a negotiation. When the familial contract becomes synonymous with indentured servitude, the only rational response is immediate termination. But the unvarnished truth is that some bonds are forged in pure exploitation, rather than love. True family is not an automatic birthright. It is a solid infrastructure built on persistent protection, steady presence, and mutual respect, not shared genetics or forced obligations. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes, it's the only way to set yourself free. I forgave them not by letting them back in, but by letting my anger go. But forgiveness does not require reconciliation, and it certainly does not require further funding of their toxic behavior. When you recognize that an environment is designed to systematically drain your resources, the most logical and compassionate thing you can do for yourself is to initiate a total, permanent divestment. Refusing to rescue toxic people who once let you drown is the ultimate form of self-respect. It is the exact moment you stop being a supporting character in their tragic drama and become the confident author of your own life. I looked out at the quiet of the lawn, knowing the balance sheets of my life were finally in perfect, unbreakable harmony. The invisible debts were permanently erased, and the future was entirely my own. Drop a comment below, share your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories on resilience, boundaries, and second chances.